Meeting at the crossroads where the forbidden subjects of politics and religion intersect. This is the Sophie Scholl Society. I'm Mel McGinnis, and to my right is James Hagberg, a young man who has been in a homeschool situation and through that situation has immersed himself into things that really interest him. And I just was talking with him about China. Well, what about China and the USA? I know there's connections there with the Bidens. It will be interesting to see how all this pans out and what will come of that. But China, why should we be interested in them? And in talking with James, wow, you can tell he's been studying about it. James, as you look at China now, especially as they relate to the U.S. relates to China, what do you see happening in that nation that Americans maybe should be aware?
Well, in modern China, I think it's something that we need to be aware that China is going to be a major player on the world stage, and that we really do need to be informed about their policies, about their stances on things, which is something that I feel like for a long period in historically, for about 40 to 100 years, China has really not been a topic that most individuals have been informed on. Even though for thousands of years, China was the center of the world through trade and its military influence. Recently, for the last 30 years, China has been expanding rapidly. And especially recently, it's been moving outward and expanding its political influence, along with economic influences. And I believe it will most likely very soon overtake Russia as the second world power. It's already overtaken Russia and almost the rest of the world, especially recently Japan, as the second economic power. And under our Biden presidency, would most likely move to challenge the U.S. economically as the world power. And I think it's just important to understand that the Chinese government is not the same machine that it was 50 years ago. That a lot of people look at China and they assume it to be the same single-party communist dictatorship and the same socialist systems that we've seen in the Soviet Union, from Cuba to Vietnam and Cambodia, Laos, and across the world, that have resulted in rather unfortunate circumstances. But I think it's important for Americans to understand that China is not the same political machine, especially under the last, I believe, eight years. I believe it was 12 actually, that President Xi Jinping of China has been in office. That the Chinese dictatorship, which in and of itself is somewhat of a misstatement of how the Chinese political machine works. It's far more complicated than most Americans think. Because China has moved itself to a position where it no longer puts communist ideologies at the forefront of its decision making, which was the case for places like the Soviet Union, for Cuba, for Venezuela, which was not specifically communist, but very close. That in a lot of ways led to mismanagement, an attempt to form this communist society, which was the goal of these places, ultimately led to their downfall, among many other things, obviously. But I think it's important for people to understand that China has almost evolved past this. That the Chinese government no longer puts its ideology at the basis for its decisions, rather productivity and efficiency. My understanding is that Xi Jinping himself, there have been massive purges in the Chinese government. They have restructured many different aspects of their government to make it as efficient as possible. The Chinese government is extremely efficient. I was recently reading an article that stated that in 1970, the Chinese the poverty rate was around 30%. And in 2018, it was lowered to almost lower than 1%. The Chinese economy has been expanding drastically for decades. And it really seems, even with recent US sanctions, it really does not seem to be slowing down. China is still listed as a developing nation. Their power is growing. And I think it's important that Americans, we understand that China is not an enemy that necessarily fears us. I think we need to understand that they're not like our dealings in the Middle East. This is not a South American country. That we need to understand. I think more Americans need to learn about China and understand them. Not because I believe that China is superior or that they will overtake us and we need to be prepared to hail our new masters. But I think it's very important to understand our opposition.
I think it is too.
It's very important.
Right. And when you bring up China like this, that they're more focused on their nation's interests rather than their ideology, I think people are, I would say, comforted in the fact, and maybe shouldn't be, that, oh, okay, they're getting rid of their communism, therefore they're not a threat. No. But I think what we see China doing, like, as I understand, a 100-year plan, they have these plans on into the future, which I think they're very focused in achieving. Kind of unlike what we have over here. And the expansionism, I think, that's taking place through China's influence is something to be very much aware of.
Yeah, I would also, when it comes to the expansionism, that's a great point. Because what a lot of people don't necessarily know about China is China's expansionistic ideals are not necessarily built on, say, imperialism. China has no intention of conquering Vietnam or conquering the Korean Peninsula. It has no interest in conquering Siberia. It does because the people of China and Chinese culture has never really focused on expanding their territory. Now, China does have very aggressive positions regarding Taiwan because they see that territory as theirs. It is a part of China to them, similar to how many of the traditionalists on Taiwan still believe that Taiwan is rightfully a part of China, that it is one, just simply under different governments. But it is also important to understand that while China does not have the objective of forcing its own specific government to rule over and administrate new territory, they're very much interested in expanding their influence. For, as I stated earlier, for thousands of years in ancient history, China was almost the center of all commerce and trade. An interesting fact is that for hundreds of years, Europeans would have done anything to trade for the goods of China. And at one point, almost all trade had to travel through the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The Ottomans took advantage of this and increased tariffs and taxes for the imports through China. Europeans specifically set out across the Atlantic to find new trade routes, not necessarily to India, but to China, and which is how they discovered the American continents. And it was with the rise of the American continents and of Europe which dwindled the Chinese influence. I think the Chinese are very much interested, from what I've seen, to return to a state where they are the dominant player in the world, where they can influence the policies of other nations, not necessarily to convert them to the same ideology as them,
right,
like the Soviet Union. They're not necessarily interested in establishing puppet regimes in America or other countries, but they're very interested in having influence. They want to be at least a world leader. Obviously, an objective would be to be the top dog. But another important thing is China is not afraid to play the long game, I don't believe. They've been doing it for decades. For years, as Americans, we have been almost, I think, too comfortable sitting at the top after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've been practically unopposed on the world stage. And many Americans, I feel, disregard China as a fairly backwater nation, with a majority backwater nation of peasants, rice farmers, basic factory workers. We don't see China as a threat. We see them as that their advancements have been taken from the that they've simply ridden the trail of American success, which I don't believe is necessarily true. I think China has in many ways forced itself to stand upright, and I think they are a threat. But I also don't think it's necessarily a situation where that America needs to go in guns a-blazing and try to stop the Chinese. I think we need to acknowledge their stance, and it might not necessarily be a bad thing because it was stated earlier that the Chinese and Xi Jinping, their main focus is on China itself. The only reason China would have any interest in other nations is not necessarily to control them and not necessarily to incorporate them into China, but to make sure that they're not acting against Chinese interests, which is, to be fair, which is what most countries do. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, into securing your own interest. The Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is only interested in the Chinese people and the Chinese nation.
He's not interested in spreading an ideology like we heard in classic communism.
No, I don't believe so, not necessarily.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, too, and I don't know it well enough, but it seems like they have adopted some capitalistic principles in order to expand the efficiency of the nation, as they also have a very controlling impact upon religious freedom.
Those are actually really interesting points. So, for the economic model that China prescribes to I would not call it necessarily socialist, which is, a more communalization of resources and the distribution thereof. And when it comes to, and when we call China capitalist, what they've done is, after various attempts of socializing their economy, almost more than any other attempt at communism before, during the Great Leap Forward under Mao Zedong, who did so specifically under the fear that China would become too capitalist, which failed and resulted in the deaths of anywhere from 20 to 50 million individuals through starvation. And now, specifically after the death of Mao Zedong, China took a very different approach. Because they saw what was happening to other communist nations. They saw what was happening. Not only did they put their ideology above all else, they put which communism and socialism, you can't be communist really without being a socialist. So they thought it was impossible to work communism without that. And so, but the Chinese found a way to kind of almost circumnavigate that by allowing various parts of the private sector to work the world market and to benefit from outside revenue. It's my understanding that China did not really have an impact on the world stage, mostly due to isolationism, especially economically, outside of other nations of the communist Comintern with the Soviet Union and the Korean Peninsula. It wasn't until, I believe, the 70s, the 80s, that China began to open up its markets. It began to expand itself economically, and it adopted a form of capitalism. And when I say capitalism, it's nothing like the free market economy that we have. It's more of an ideology of corporatism, which is very similar to what traditional fascists, like in what they instituted in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and Spain, which is a form of capitalism that allows for the private sector, allows for individual, usually mega corporations, to run specific instances, but the government still has that control and regulation to make sure that they are working in the interest of the state. To produce as much as possible and to be as efficient as possible while still benefiting the state and the people, which has allowed China to thrive.
Right. And as you see this thriving economically, I feel like for the Christians over there, still, it's very difficult, I think, at times for them to freely preach the gospel, testify to the faith, because of this government control over their lives.
And that's also true. For the religious difficulties that China faces I think it's fairly clear that democracy, free liberal democracy, and freedoms of individual rights like freedom of speech and expression are almost inherently inefficient. They're almost inherently, they cause division and they cause kind of little problems. It doesn't mean they're wrong. It doesn't mean they're bad, but they have those problems. Look at the United States. I don't believe there's any other country that really guarantees individual rights and freedoms like the United States. And we're divided. We're divided as a nation. Which is not necessarily wrong, because, I mean, if you want a totally united nation, then you have to go down a path of authoritarianism and stop dissent, which is what China has been doing. And when it comes to the religious problems, is that I found something interesting. China currently is the only nation in the world that has officially declared itself to be a strictly atheist country. Almost now, that does not mean that China does not recognize other religions, though. There is certain religions, or at least sects thereof, that are accepted by the Chinese Communist Party. There is a form of Chinese accepted Catholicism. Mind you, there is no forms of Protestantism, Catholicism, and Islam, and Hinduism. There are churches that the Communist Party allows in specific circumstances. However, the texts that they are allowed to preach are oftentimes altered to help them flow with the narrative of the Chinese society and their government. And we see that a lot, that the Chinese government, it doesn't want people to hear these ideas, not only from Christians, but also, I'm sure many people have heard of the difficulties that the Muslim population in the Xinjiang, northwestern China, has been facing. And China has had a problem with that for decades.
Yeah.
They've been cracking down, and that's what we've heard about re-education camps.
Yeah.
And the purpose, and these aren't necessarily the same as concentration camps that the Nazis used or the Soviets used with the purpose of exterminating the population. The purpose of these camps are to re-educate, to change their mind forcefully, because China doesn't want dissenting opinions in its nation because they're inherently ineffective. They want the most effective system that they can achieve, and when you have other people saying unpopular things that doesn't jive with the rest of the society, that can cause division. And that's what the Chinese government has been doing. And yeah, it has been having a lot with Christians. They've been doing their best to suppress these things across the board in almost all religions.
Yeah, I would like to pick up on this conversation, but if you've been tuning in, you've seen or you've heard some things today that you may have not known before about China, how much of a role they play in regards to international commerce and trade and our own corporations here in the U.S. Think of the NBA, how they are entrenched there in China and are impacted by the government on what they can say and should not say. Maybe we'll explore this as another time. But James, thank you for coming today and joining me here on the Sophie Scholl Roundtable.